we're just going to kick off with our next speaker. So she's having Wi-Fi issues, so she's pre-recorded us a video as well of her presentation. So she's here, but yeah, she's here for questions and stuff at the end. So here's something that she prepared earlier, and this is Sarah Cupples, who's a UX designer in Rapid7, and she's going to talk a bit about frictionless design and why it's not always like as perfect as it sounds.
In 2015, Nextdoor, a social network which connects users in local neighborhoods, had a real racial profiling problem. Its users were reporting Black and Latino individuals as suspicious for simply walking down the street. And in researching the issue, Nextdoor found that their easy-to-use interface was a major part of the problem. Now, as members of the tech industry, creating easy-to-use experiences is something we all likely aspire to every single day, and this is by no means an inherently bad thing. However, in recent years, the tech industry has become seemingly obsessed with eliminating moments of friction to simplify experiences and drive user engagement. And this has led to the rise of an approach that some call frictionless design. But there has been little consideration into how frictionless design is affecting users. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is how, even though frictionless design aims to improve user experience, it can actually allow users to act on unconscious racial bias. And I'll also touch on how reintroducing friction can help to challenge this. So before I get into how frictionless design affects user behavior and thinking and how reintroducing some friction can sort of challenge this, I wanted to touch on what frictionless design actually is. So frictionless design is an approach which focuses on minimizing friction, or the amount of friction that a user interacts with, in order to generate experiences that are simple, convenient, and fast. And points of friction might include the likes of modals or text fields. And the main aim of minimizing points of friction like this is to allow the user to complete tasks as quickly and easily as possible, while using sort of a minimal amount of thinking and effort. And if you think about the products that you use sort of every day, it's easy to see how widely adopted frictionless design actually is. From Amazon's one-click ordering to Uber's self-proclaimed seamless pickups, many companies boast frictionless-led products. And there's actually two reasons why frictionless design is so popular. The first is that there's a highly competitive product market. So we see time and time again that if a product is complex or if it slows users down, it'll be overtaken by a newer, more streamlined product or competitor. So what companies will do is they'll eliminate friction in their products in order to drive up user engagement and give themselves a competitive advantage over their competitors. And the second reason why frictionless design is so popular is because of rising user expectation. So as more and more products deliver frictionless experiences, this is setting a new standard for users. Users expect products to work without disruption, and they're not willing to invest additional time to accomplish tasks. Facebook's Zero Friction Future report actually found that among users, there's a rapidly rising demand for convenient experiences. Findings also showed that users who experience pain points within products are likely to switch to a competitor with a sort of more effortless, hassle-free experience. And both of these factors feed into one another and become almost like a cycle. As products become more effortless and convenience-driven, user expectations rise while their tolerance for slower experiences drops. And this cycle has occurred with minimal consideration from companies or the tech industry at large into what effect it's having on users. how is continually reducing friction impacting user behaviour and thinking? And this leads us into the consequences of frictionless design. So we touched on the fact that frictionless design prioritizes speed, simplicity, and convenience. And what this actually does is it triggers a certain way of thinking that enables unconscious racial bias to influence user sort of behavior and decision making. Cognitive psychologists have found that our brains have two operating systems, System 1 and System 2. Each system has its own characteristics that will influence user behavior. So System 1 thinking is automatic, involuntary, and very fast in delivering information to the user. A good example of System 1 thinking is if, for example, somebody smiles at you, you instantly recognize and understand that they're happy. You don't have to think about it at all. And System 1 is actually where sort of unconscious bias resides. So just as a side note, unconscious bias refers to the stereotypes that affect our behaviors and decisions unconsciously. So even if a user in their conscious mind has anti-racist values, it's still possible for them to have unconscious racial bias that negatively affects their behavior without them really being aware of it. And then on the other hand, you have System 2 thinking. So System 2 is characterized by slower, more deliberate thought. And a good example of System 2 is if, for example, I ask you to do 17 times 27 right now, it's likely going to take you a moment or a few minutes if you're like me to figure it out. So one of the main functions of System 2 is actually to monitor and control the thoughts, bias, and actions that are suggested by System 1, and then to modify or suppress them if needs be. So these are the two systems of thinking that can affect user behavior. And there are a few different things that can determine whether System 1 or System 2 thinking is used, including the complexity of an interaction. So because frictionless design generates simple, fast interactions that require minimal effort, System 1 thinking is typically used while System 2 thinking remains dormant. And if you think about their key characteristics with, System 1 holding unconscious bias and System 2 trying to suppress it, because System 2 isn't engaged, it means that there's nothing to stop unconscious racial bias from influencing user behavior. I know that was a lot of theory and a lot to digest. So to try and illustrate systems thinking and how it affects users a bit better, I have an example. So if you think of Airbnb, which simplified the process of hosting and renting accommodation, when a user applies to rent accommodation, Airbnb allows the host, who is the individual that owns the property, to accept or reject the booking after reviewing the applicant information. And this information typically consists of the user's name and their profile photo. However, according to researchers at Harvard University, this design decision sort of allows for racial discrimination. Their study found that guests with distinctly African American names are 16% less likely to be accepted to rent a property than guests with distinctively white names. And this is shocking. And what they found was that unconscious bias was at the core of this problem. Hosts were able to review a name which activated unconscious racial bias, and then reject a guest without having to really think or state why. And this lack of friction meant that only System 1 was engaged. Users didn't have to think critically about why they were rejecting someone, and unconscious racial bias was then able to influence the decision-making process. But what can be done then to change or challenge racial bias in users? How can we trigger a switch to System 2 thinking and facilitate conscious decision making and challenge unconscious racial bias? the answer that more and more designers are suggesting is through, oh, sorry, I missed a slide, but the answer that more and more designers are suggesting is through friction. So it's important to note that in this context, friction holds a different meaning than what you might assume. So designers aren't advocating for the addition of friction that would add lots of hurdles or slow users' experience down significantly. Instead, there's a growing movement behind the concept of meaningful friction, which is friction that has been intentionally designed and would be introduced into user interactions with care. And these purposefully designed friction points would help to encourage reflective behaviour on the user's part through activating System 2 thinking, which would enable users to become more aware of their decisions and ensure that racial biases, or help to ensure that racial biases would be suppressed and modified. And sort of the end result of this is, positive behaviour change on the user's end, which would help to challenge their unconscious racial bias. But as good as this sounds, and as nice as this would it actually work? Can meaningful friction actually help reduce instances of racism driven by unconscious racial bias? The short answer is yes. So if you think back to the start of my talk, before all of my rambling, I mentioned a service called Nextdoor and how their easy to use interface became a hub of racial profiling. This actually happened because within their crime and safety category, where users can post reports about suspicious activity in their community, the process of posting was virtually frictionless. Users simply had to fill in a blank form with a subject line. And because they could write whatever they wanted, System 2 thinking was not engaged and racial bias flourished, resulting in reports that were disproportionately focused on race. And according to Sarah Leary, who is one of Nextdoor's founders, the lack of friction meant that many users were unconsciously racially profiling. So to actually tackle their racial profiling issue, Nextdoor slowed users down. They introduced friction into the process of posting suspicious behaviour by adding steps to their crime and safety report. For example, the report's description section now contains multiple specific fields such as age, gender, as well as race. And if a user enters data into the race field, they are required at minimum to fill in 2 additional fields about a subject's appearance. And then going even further than that, Nextdoor also added a checklist that users must go through before reporting an incident, which explicitly reminds them not to focus solely on race. And by introducing these sort of small, meaningful friction points into the user's experience, Nextdoor was able to reduce the incidence of racial profiling within their platform by 75%, which is a massive number. So Nextdoor found that adding friction stops users before posting racist content and encourages a switch to reflective System 2 thinking. And according to Jennifer Eberhardt, who was tasked with addressing Nextdoor's racial profiling problem, when users have time to reflect on their decisions, it can lead to more open-minded interactions and, like I was saying, prompts the switch to critical System 2 thinking. And the end sort of result of this is that users become more mindful of their own unconscious racial biases and impulses. And that awareness can actually help to drive instances down and make users more aware about when they're going to potentially engage in something that is racist. Now, with everything that I've talked about today and the reintroducing of sort of friction points into experiences, it isn't to say that we should be adding friction everywhere and that it will solve all of our problems. But if you take anything away from my talk today, I hope that it's meaningful friction can and should be used in contexts with sort of heightened criticality and sensitivity, and that a little bit of friction, if designed right, can make a huge difference. Thanks for listening.
Sarah, that was amazing. Clap, clap, claps all the way around. Now there are a few questions in the chat, if you're happy enough to answer them. So yeah, there was a lot of sort of conversation as you went through that about, is it more identity based or people based being the issue here, rather than the sort of UX side of things. And it's like, there was a question like, would being anonymous fix this and stuff? But I don't know if you want to maybe comment on that or anything, and just sort of say like, about a bit more about the sort of unconscious bias that maybe we have.
Yeah, so I think maybe the anonymous point was to do with the Airbnb piece, and yeah, I think in that case, maybe anonymity would have been helpful, not displaying the username, or, having some sort of form that you could sort of fill in as well that sort of states why you're rejecting someone. Because with sort of limited information like that, that's when unconscious bias gets triggered. And, if you take a minute to actually explain why you're rejecting someone, it triggers that system two thinking. So I think it is a bit of both, but it's just understanding the sort of broader context of the experience, and, being able to understand the user's frame of mind going into it and trying to mitigate any issues that might arise.
Yeah.
That answers the question, but
it's fab. I think secondly was, can you catch unconscious bias before the product development or design starts?
I think you definitely can anticipate it. It's about, I think, being more aware of just the broader context and the other cases that have happened within the tech industry. There's countless examples where design hasn't been fully thought through, or it has unintentionally triggered unconscious bias, and there's been a slew of racist incidents. And I think it's just learning from those cases and then trying to implement those learnings into your sort of development cycle. Even like this, for the sake of Nextdoor, it proved that, there are definitely instances where your design needs to be slower and it needs to be more considered. And again, it's about knowing the context that you're in and being able to apply that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Also, have you seen this in your work, and if so, what measures have you tried to implement?
I haven't actually seen it in my own work, but if I was going to learn from anything from the use cases that maybe I've discussed in the video and from my wider research, it's definitely that friction isn't a bad thing. I think as designers and sort of in broader sort of product world, friction is sometimes talked about as a bad thing. We want to get users from A to B as quickly as possible, but there's definitely a case for taking things slow. I'm trying to think if there's an example that I can share with you guys, but I can't think of one right now. But if I do, I will pass along some resources.
Perfect. And then lastly, I kind of had a question, which was, how did you go about researching this? And like, is there any sort of good resources that you would have to find data surrounding this sort of stuff?
So this is actually my dissertation subject. So this is some of the research that I did for it. It was literally just reading as much as I could and buying random books that I thought could be related to this. Because Frictionless Design doesn't really pull that many results at the minute on Google. So there's definitely a lot of amazing resources out there. The two that I found most enlightening was two books actually. One was Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt. She's the social psychologist that sort of researched Nextdoor, and her book has amazing use cases like Nextdoor, and it touches on Airbnb and how even the smallest changes can really trigger more reflective thinking in users. And the other one that kind of goes into systems thinking and system 1 and system 2 is thinking fast and slow. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, but like it's the book by Daniel, I don't know how to say his last name, Canham, but it's really good, and it's not just sort of design focused, it's in the broader context of the world, how these systems thinking will influence how we approach our lives, basically. Those are the two.
Yeah, Chris has a question. Take a second.
Sorry, I don't have a question because I love that use case. When I originally signed up with Nextdoor, I didn't want people knowing who I was, so I put my name as undefined user. And then 2 weeks later, they tried to kick me off the platform because I didn't give a real name, which shows that they're checking on things. I love this term like frictionless design. Is there cases where you want to cause frictionless users to like slow them down and make them actually think about what they're doing and like purposely prevent them from just like, we all want to, like, as you said in the song, you want to one click and everything. Is there kind of the case where like you need to slow the user down?
Yeah, definitely. I think working in sort of the product world, we deal with potentially a lot of sensitive customer information and users input things. And I think one of the main ones is like delete states. We don't want users to just be able to click like the little bin emoji and then that information's gone forever. We want to maybe have a modal or something that says, you're not getting this back. You really have to think about this. So it's not that system 1 thinking, they click the button and it's gone. The modal slows them down enough that system 2 then kicks in and they're like, oh, I really need to consider this. I think that's one of the main ones. Another example could be, it's in the broader sort of world, is social media and sort of hate posting. I know there was an example, I'm trying to like recall it now. I think it's a program called Rethink, and it was trying to stop teen hate posting. So what they did was, I don't know how the program worked, but whenever a teenager was going to post something offensive or racist, it would stop them and say, this, we flagged this, it's offensive, do you still want to post it? And 97% of people that saw that decided not to post. So it's like, yeah, there's a couple of instances, but like, it is really interesting how much it can affect you, even if it's like a tiny modal or something.
He was on mute, but he said, it's pretty cool. But no, that's amazing, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing that.